Today we have our panel, Design Interactions, Diverse Perspectives. We're here in DesignLab. DesignLab is a design and fabrication facility. We have a residency program. Our third cohort just started. We're really excited to have their projects getting going in the lab. Without further ado, I think we should get started with the panelists, and they're going to introduce themselves. So here we go.
So my name is Selwa Sweidan. I have an innovation R&D practice serving intelligent systems and also new technologies. It's client-facing and also research academic-facing.
A lot of mics here. My name is Sara Schnadt. I am a UX designer and performance installation artist with a dual practice in those two things. Currently, I am working at NASA Jet Propulsion Lab as a human-centered design lead for a flagship mission to Europa, a moon of Jupiter. And recently, I've also worked on projects at a data science startup for scientists and at an aerospace startup that's imaging the whole planet every day with satellite imagery, and in a couple different projects of civic data access and visualization in the field of digital journalism.
Hello. My name is Christine Meinders, and I'm part of a group, Feminist AI. We have an innovation practice, and we additionally have a community-facing practice as well. Part of this research that we're doing right now is taking place with the XR studio at Mozilla, and then another part of the research is here in Los Angeles, so kind of bridging San Francisco and LA in the work. We're very excited about our recent project, which is reimagining concepts of normalcy and mental health. So if you're interested, go to feminist.ai and hit me up personally and join the project. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Basak Alper. My background is in information visualization and human-computer interaction. Currently, I'm working at JPL in the Human-Centered Design group. Like I said, I was coming from academia, and I found myself doing UX almost accidentally at JPL, and I'm kind of learning it along the way, which is very different than how it is done in academia, certainly. And I also work on visualization projects related to automation at JPL. I'm interested in how we can improve trust in people's perception of, artificial intelligence, automation. I'll talk about those projects later. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Maggie Hendrie. I chair the Interaction Design Department at ArtCenter College of Design here in Pasadena. I also co-direct the Interactive Data Visualization Program with Caltech and JPL. And I have my own practice, typically more recently looking at things that range from autonomous vehicles, connected cities, and working with a series of startups as well as more established companies in how they can build interaction practices within their own organizations, as well as develop new products and systems.
So I just wanted to start with a brief definition of some of the terms we're going to be using, so in case anyone in the audience is unfamiliar. So UX stands for user experience, and that encompasses basically the entire experience of a user when interacting with a product, service, or company, from the initial interaction to the function of the product to their entire experience. This can include UI, which is user interface design, which is the actual interface that people will be interacting with, whether that's a digital interface or the industrial design of the product. And then finally, AI stands for artificial intelligence, which is the concept and development of computer systems with human characteristics, so visual perception, decision-making capabilities. No? Okay. Well, I will have our panelists assist with the definitions as well. If you guys want to add to that, we can start.
No, I really appreciate your perspective, and I think oftentimes there's a misconception that artificial intelligence very much relies on reinforcing and reimagining current thinking that models the human brain. But actually, intelligence is so much more than that. If you look at the spectrum between knowledge and intelligence, feminist theorist Alison Adam writes a lot about this, but we're informed by a lot of these intelligent systems that aren't necessarily inspired by human approaches, but they're also inspired by nature. Very specifically, let's look at some of these things like the flocking algorithm, swarming algorithm. You know, there are so many different ways that we can incorporate and design this thinking. And while I really, really love this idea of the UX of AI, I think it's a really wonderful entry point for people who don't understand what's happening. And I think that's great. I think UX is a wonderful way for the design community to gain entry into the AI community, and I'd say vice versa. But really, I think a lot of us here probably feel the same way. We should be pushing this thinking to be more systems-driven, to be a part of this larger kind of knowledge system approach, and very specifically understand that there are different parts, right? Different ways that we can push this.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really fantastic definition. I think it's really interesting that this conversation is framed as the UX of AI, and as Christine said, this is a fantastic entry point. To me, it signals talking to designers about their roles in building intelligent systems, services, and designing for intelligent agents. But I also think the title needs to be updated in that I think some of the titles we use here on this, I think Christine and I, for example, use the title AI designer, but it indicates a shift in really trying to update the practices, the methodologies, and the tenets of user-centric design to go beyond what has been called human-centered design and really think about a much more complex system. And that demands a whole different set of understanding and skills.
Thank you that even in your introduction we all lit up, right?
No, that's great.
There's like no lack of opinion.
Yeah.
I even have a challenge with UX, just so we can.
So much encompasses all of these terms.
So much has happened. I think a couple of things that I think about when I'm in these conversations is less around what are the boundaries and definitions between designers and more about how am I showing relevancy and value to the people I'm collaborating with, right? Because over the years I've had the joy of spending hundreds of hours with colleagues over years describing, well, what's an information architect versus user experience, or what's the difference between architect versus designer versus strategist, and it's very useful, but it's also very constraining. So that's one thing. And the second thing that I'm noticing in practice right now, both in education and in design, creative solution design, is that the word intelligence and artificial, these words are leading us down a path that is very human. It's about our imagination. It's around the idea of that we anthropomorphize the word intelligence, and we think of you as an intelligent person. And rather than seeing the analogies with the very little that we know about brain science or the science of mind, gives us some clues that have allowed us to develop machine learning tools and algorithms. So that's a very nuanced, kind of built, laddered way of understanding those words, right? And really, that's about how do we design different kinds of algorithms, right? And by calling this kind of cognitive algorithm or cognitive design artificial intelligence, we immediately leap into HAL and her and robotics and an anthropomorphization. And I think that's why I responded when you said, oh, it's about using human attributes in an artificial intelligence. You know, it's like if my kettle's talking to the toaster, they don't need to smile at one another, right? So I just think it's a really invigorating conversation. Maybe they do, right? They should. But I think that as designers, our job is to show relevancy, and sometimes we need to be really careful with our terminology because our partners in engineering, computing science, and machine learning are hypervigilant about their use of language.
the human isn't the only frame of reference for these things.
I just wanted to I know this is turning into an extended dialogue.
This is the whole idea. Yeah.
I just wanted to provide an example that builds off what you just said, Maggie. So I'm part of a working group for Europa Clipper that is looking at how we're going to do planning of science activities of 9 instruments on this spacecraft. And for various reasons for this mission, for some constraints that we have for how it can happen, we are considering using machine learning-based planning to optimize what can be planned when. We're looking at that. And in this working group, one of the people doing the software design kind of lightly said something about, oh, this complex thing we're trying to figure out, the software is smart, so it's just going to resolve that. And then the person who's responsible for the prototyping of this type of software, and people get very passionate in these meetings because everyone's very brilliant and animated, and it's quite something to see. Anyway, he just jumped in and he was just like, the software is only as smart as the people who are designing the algorithms for the software. And he
I've definitely heard that before.
he felt very strongly about that, and I think it's something to remember is that humans are designing this software.
Exactly. And that was a great transition into the next question. If you guys could say a little bit about your current projects that you're working on, and did you have one more thing to say? Great.
And actually, this kind of ties it to, from what Sara left, I'm going to tie it to UX. And with artificial intelligence especially, there is this public perception that machines are going to do it all, as if we are going to take a back seat. But it doesn't happen that way at all. It's just there's always a man-machine interface. The nature of that interface is changing. Like how we communicate to the machine is changing, but it is just a change in paradigm. It is not going away, not at all. So we still need to interact with these automated systems, and we still need to be able to understand them. So that is, I think, the main, connection between artificial intelligence and UX.
They aren't necessarily independent of the people working on them, of course. All right, so if you guys could, we can go around and explain what projects you're currently working on and what you're excited for the future of interaction design, UX, AI, all of the above. Just briefly, and then we'll get more in depth.
What stuff are we excited about? So given that I work in an art and design college, I have the privilege of seeing hundreds of projects every year. Some of my own teaching and research recently, over the last 4 or 5 years, has been in response to a question from the automotive industry and the mobility space, which is around what is the future user experience in the autonomous connected car, right? So that's a huge question that brings us into how do we visualize data, how do we build a connected urban and suburban and environment. But I think some of the questions that are relevant to our conversation that come up are, what do people need to see, feel, and be exposed to and engage with to participate in the human in the loop part of a machine learning? How do you build trust? What components of the way the machine is thinking do people need to understand, be exposed to, and have engagement in? How do we manage data? How do we build teams that reflect the diversity of the people? And I think something that we started to chat about while we were waiting for you guys is the area I'm interested in right now is we've had so much task-based UX methodology, right? Whether it's agile or waterfall, it's all been very interesting. We're even arguing now about should it be jobs-based or tasks-based in agile. And it really takes away the focus sometimes from the fact is that increasingly these systems are profile-based. They're based on what we think we understand of the human, and we're increasingly creating proxies to represent that human. And that is rattled with issues, right? Math, where we encode all our bias, right? So I'm particularly looking at what are the methodologies we can bring into team building, into, let's just say, persona development. A human being cannot be an edge case, but a task or a job can be in our current methodology. So I'm trying to think my way through methodologies that will allow for prototyping, for development, for storyboarding and story making, to convey this to all of the people that need to be orchestrated to make a potential solution in that space.
I work on many different projects at JPL, but I'm going to talk about just one which is very relevant to this panel. I'm working with Mars 2020 mission, which is going to utilize an automated scheduling system for its activity planning. And automated scheduling has been out there for 20 years, but hasn't been adopted by spacecraft activity planning for a long time because there is absolutely no room for failure. That's why operators are very hesitant to rely on an automated system which might fail, right, without their control. So we work with engineers, scientists who have done this job, who are very competent. And it is very hard for them to let go of this control. They are having this type A-ness kind of thing. And I'm trying to develop visualizations to show how the automated system is behaving. And I'm trying to understand what it would take for them to trust the system, you know. And is it like showing them more data? Is it like, because there are, you know, a lot of how should I say? You can show very little data, and it might be very misleading. They might arrive at the conclusion that this is what it is, and it might, you know, give false positives. And once the system fails in the end, it will break the trust completely, right? Then the software that we devoted, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars to develop might be shelved. We still, you know, have that fear, you know, will operators trust? On the other hand, you can bombard them with information, and they won't be able to understand anything. Again, you know, they will be like, you know, oh, this can go anywhere. You know, how would I trust this? So we are really trying to understand what it would take for humans to trust an automated system and how much information that needs to be revealed to them. Like calibrating that is very hard. And yeah, that is what I'm most excited about these days.
Great. All right, well, interesting work. I think some of the interesting opportunities that we have as designers in this space is to broaden our approach and our thinking in regards to how we engage in these systems. And a lot of these design approaches, very specifically looking at emergent technologies in conjunction with AI and how we're understanding and designing across these experiences, across realities. You see a lot of combining of AI research with Unity, prototyping, and VR, AR. And I think that there's kind of a whole space. It's incredibly exciting. For my personal work, that I'm engaging in right now with businesses, it's the AI design tool. And I'm very excited about the AI design tool because you really start to understand how we can make transparent a lot of the thinking that goes into AI design. Very specifically, people aren't really aware, like, this is the outcome, this is the output. How did we get this, right? What data is going into this? Who created this data? And I think doing something, let's take something like HTML tagging. If we start this concept of AI tagging, how can we understand kind of the thinking and the bias that exists in the models, that exists in the data, that exists in the materials, that is reproduced and recreated in the form? The humanization of individuals, in the gendering of individuals in these technologies. We can see kind of in the process where that happens. So I think really focusing on these tools is a really, really important way to engage in education so the community can start to understand what's wrong with a lot of these products and see some of the opportunities available.
One of the things that I'm working on primarily now, which I'm most excited about, is something that I've been working on in different contexts for a while, which is facilitating a change process, a cultural change process. In my own experience, some of the more innovative spaces where technological innovation is happening are spaces that are engineering-led. At least that's been true in my own working life. And so insinuating myself as a designer into those situations, like at Anaconda, which is the data science startup where I was working. They do the Python distribution, if anyone has heard of them. I was their first human-centered designer, so I was convincing the team I was part of to include me and to gradually introduce human-centered design concepts into their working process, which is both challenging and also very exciting, because the impact there, the potential impact of the outcomes of the work is really significant. Also at Planet, where I worked for a year prior to JPL, I built them a design team. They didn't have one before that. So then the people exploring all the satellite imagery that they're making available will be able to actually make sense of this kind of dizzying quantity of this new kind of data set that they're exploring. And that kind of process is what I'm engaged with at JPL too. And there it's really about becoming part of the team that is conceptualizing this mission, working on the design of the architecture for the ground data system as well as the software. And that's been a really exciting process of gradually building trust and having to actually understand what all these systems engineers are doing from their perspective, like actually just understand their work.
Could you elaborate a little bit on the concepts you're talking about with human-centered design?
Oh, sure. Which ones?
Just briefly, like you said, you bring human-centered design concepts to this field. What would be like sort of some basic definitions of that for?
So for example, at Anaconda, which was then called Continuum Analytics, the data visualization library that I was working on didn't have a GUI in order to do any authoring of data visualizations. So I helped them develop themes, templates, kinds of interactions that could be GUI-based for authoring data visualizations. At Planet, I helped them to have a non-engineer, software engineer-led solution for an interface, basically.
Yep.
And in my current role, it's early in the mission. It's a couple years earlier in its life cycle than the one that Basak is working on. And so we're just in the process of early design of the whole system. So thinking about human-centered processes in even how systems engineers problem solve their problems, how people communicate with each other. There's a lot of alignment needs for this very, very large project with all these specialists. And then also laying the foundations in a whole lot of user research with scientists who will be using our planning tools to start to build towards what those solutions will be.
Awesome. Thank you. I think that's helpful.
It's wonderful to hear all of the overlaps and sort of differences in practice. Really fascinating and exciting. These are some women I want to continue talking with after this panel. But in my own practice, I mentioned I shift between a client-facing R&D innovation practice to also an academic teaching practice. I teach in a new bachelor's program at Santa Monica College. It's an interaction design program where my students get to be my guinea pigs in terms of how to shift this user-centered design approach to more of an AI design approach, how to communicate that to teams, as Maggie was talking about as well, and what methodologies to update or innovate on. In my client-facing work, I've been very excited. I offer services, offer cross-sector services, but most recently I've been engaging in urban air mobility innovation, probing the future of mobility solutions, looking at a few different cities, but really mirroring what Maggie mentioned. Clients they're not as concerned with what your definitions or within your own space, the arguments about the definitions and the methodologies, although I find that a really interesting, important conversation to have, but really sort of the 4 ways I break it down in my mind is, first of all, being able to have conversations around what models you're choosing to use, how you're collecting data, how you're annotating data.
So something Maggie mentioned was a perfect lead into the next question. Storytelling comes up so often in these conversations of user experience design and user interaction design. Why do you think that is, and what is so important about storytelling in these fields?
I think So I feel like this is an interesting question. I feel like storytelling is a way to sell or advocate for a way of thinking, and it's very important. I mean, it's one of our strongest or most used currencies within teams. We're talking to each other, right? So being able to bring on stakeholders or communicate key concerns is wrapped around a story. We've heard some really interesting stories too. I mean, we could talk abstractly about theories and thinking, but illustrating that through design artifacts, which you could argue as being a story, or cases or situations, I think is just a really important tool within
it's like
a
a good
design
point
context.
of access for everyone.
Yeah.
For me, I think storytelling, I feel like one of the things I bring to a project as a UX designer is the ability to listen and synthesize and articulate. And in a very intensely engineering culture, which is where I like to be, I may be the person who can do that better than a lot of the other people that I'm working with. So being able to articulate what I've heard back to the person, being able to help facilitate more understanding between different people in a project. I find that I can be that person. Last week, I spent 3 days intensively doing it for the mission for a big gate review to help the messaging through a series of presentations of the entire mission design. Yeah, I think those are the main ways. It's just having really good communication skills is just a very versatile skill, I think.
It's like a way of translating some of the messages.
Yeah, I was going to just acknowledge what Sara was saying about being able to synthesize and also generate. So I think that storytelling is a design artifact, and it can range from a speculative fiction right through to a storyboard of the contextual use of a given tool, feature, or whatever interaction you're thinking. But I also think it serves as a kind of rallying point for a diverse audience, because it also helps people step away from I want, I think, I need, and we start moving into what character needs, or that persona, or that person in that situation and in that scenario. So I think it's very valuable. And it also allows people to do basically experimental thinking, right? You're able to use test case and run thought experiments on scenarios. So in terms of if you're ever managing a large team in a large project, it's also a very cheap way to prototype, right? So when people think, oh, it's an arty thing, we're going to tell a story, I often remind partners and clients it's actually a very cheap way to work out what's not going to work in you before you code, right? So as a methodology, as an artifact, and as a team building exercise, I think that synthesis is something that drives it, and an increasing part of the skill set of a designer is actually not to have a wonderful, innovative idea, it's to facilitate that experience for other people in the room.
So I'll add a very different perspective coming from like putting my information visualization researcher hat on. In information visualization, it was, if you look at like 5-6 years before, it was mostly about designing these interactive things for expert users, enabling them to discover things. They would kind of go in there, tweak things, formulate queries, and discover things. That was the whole thing. But as visualization became more and more accessible to general public, it has become almost like a media channel in its own. It became a communication tool. And how should I say, visualization became a media channel, and it adopted narrative, and we looked at how, visualization research community tried to understand how this works, why it helps. And generally it is, one aspect of it is memorability, really. If I tell you a coherent story right now, I'm going to bombard you with a ton of information. But if I tell you in a coherent way, you are more likely to remember and digest this information. Imagine like reading a novel in fragments, like random chapters, or reading it like, in a sequential order, in which way you were more likely to remember this story. In which way you would be more convinced that there is a coherence, the conclusions that I'm giving you are not random, but there is a step-by-step like derivation of things. instead of giving you, here are like 20 pieces of information, and this is my conclusion, and let you kind of agree with me right in the spot, I'm, taking you along with me in my derivation process. With this information, I looked at this, made this conclusion, then I looked at this, and this led to this conclusion, and in the end, giving them, so you're kind of convincing the audience along the way and explaining your thought process. That is the real benefit of storytelling, I think.
I think there's some wonderful views here. I'll just wrap up with, I think there's a wonderful opportunity, again, to co-create with multiple voices these stories, and that speaks more towards inclusivity and who's telling these stories and for whom, right? And I think those are larger questions that we need to be mindful of.
That is a perfect transition to the next question. We've all alluded to this a little bit, but in what ways is AI inaccessible? Who are we not designing for at the moment with AI?
Sure. I love that question. I think a lot of the terms and approaches we use to engage in AI thinking and AI design are completely not accessible to people. Even, let's just take the last couple of years looking at LA meetup experiences. If you want to learn about AI, where do you go? What do you do? And a lot of times when you go into these environments, it's very much something is explained to you. Something is explained to you as a voice who's not present in that space. You're not aware of that space. And I personally felt that when I started researching inclusive approaches to AI a couple of years ago, and I looked towards theory, a lot of existing research done by feminist theorists, which really kind of helped me understand it's not inclusive, not only because of the language, oftentimes, not only because of the way that it's presented, but we don't really have these tools where it's necessarily easy for us to understand. I do think kind of co-creating these tools can allow us to create a shared language for what we would like to learn and for the perspectives that we would like to have. I think there's a wonderful opportunity there.
I wanted to mention that AI has galvanized everyone's imagination. Algorithms have been piloting a lot of our interactions and experience for, 60, 70 years now, right? Since the mid-50s, really. So really what we need to think about more is who's engaged in developing how an algorithm behaves and works. AI has its own special set of consequences and opportunities, but Virginia Eubanks writes very well about the inequity every time we go downtown. Who gets to apply for social housing? Who gets to pay what level of tax? Who gets what kind of treatment in their health care or their pension plan, right? So algorithms have been determining a lot of people's human experience for quite some time, right? And the question is who gets considered when those, what used to be called business logic or data logic or rules engines or expert systems, when they're built. And I think that's the question of, do we have diverse teams? Do we have enough advocacy? Are we aware of the social, political, and personal ramifications of the business models that sit behind the people who are even producing some of these tools? So that's where you start hearing and seeing voices that are not represented. And one of the examples that I thought was, well, there are tons of examples of fails out there, right? There's a fellow called Robert Lee. He's trying to go into his home country of New Zealand, or a state where he was a student, I believe. And, he's told that he can't pass the automatic passport booth because his eyes aren't open, right? And his eyes are very open. He's of Asian heritage, and the system was never tested, designed, used for this, right? And it's so atrocious that we laugh, right? But is that because it's AI? There's a lot of reasons why that occurred, and AI is, the little black box of AI is the least of them, actually. So while I encourage us to be motivated by the questions that are raised by AI, I'd also encourage us to be just as diligent and vigilant on how all of our systems that rely on data, personalization, and rules engines work in our communities.
The people behind them, like we said.
So I'm going to, again, voice in a more information visualization perspective. One of the new things that I'm working on information visualization domain is like visualization literacy. This is about how easy it is to deceive people with visualizations, actually. How easy it is to, and when people see visualizations, they actually trust it more. They kind of view it as like some scientific thing, some objective thing. And this is the same for AI, I think. If kind of an AI algorithm tells you this is what it is, people take it for granted without understanding biases involved. And a lot part of visualization literacy involves understanding the questioning of the data source. Where is this data coming from? How it is filtered? Obviously, I'm not looking how the data is collected, who filtered it, who created it. I know how it is kind of put in this shape and form, with what reasoning. So it is very important to give people this kind of literacy of questioning data in general is very important.
I would just echo the point about I think part of the challenge is outside of the black box of a machine learning process, where just as intentional as in any other design process of exactly who you're making something for and why, and how you're going to validate that the outcome is meeting that person's needs, it's just the same. I think that there is some perception that machine learning based processes are wizardry of some sort. And having worked on teams and sat next to people for long periods of time who are doing this kind of work, it's it can be a black box even to the people that do it. It takes a certain amount of effort to just trace the logic that's being used and make sure that you understand what you're validating and that you're doing it in an effective way, even when you're making something that is driven by algorithms. And to have conceptual tools that will help you do that, and to think about what those could be that could be legible to non-experts, I think is an area that at least I haven't seen that much work in. And I think that could be a good area to be developed too.
I agree. I think there's a huge opportunity, and I imagine people in this space, people attracted to the conversation of what is the UX of AI or the future of the role of someone who might call themselves a designer designing for intelligent systems. I imagine we might be involved in making those tools. But it's really interesting to go back to the idea of fails and sort of what gets to be part of public discourse. And I sort of sometimes have strong reactions to certain narratives, questioning whether they're really empowering us to further interrogate algorithmic design, AI design, UX of AI. For example, the notion of the singularity narrative, which is one that's really exciting, but sort of takes us away from current fails that are really important to talk about. And those fails are really exciting because it's sort of pushing organizations to really address this, because these become huge liabilities, huge embarrassments, huge potential losses. And that's an opportunity, too, for us to broach those conversations. So I think because of those fails, there's more opportunity to have these discussions about what inclusion is around AI.
Right. So we've begun to touch on the inequalities and lack of diversity in the tech industry. What are some strategies you all have implemented or would recommend for people who are overwhelmed by these challenges and issues? Yes, go.
I can talk about it. Okay, so I went to a women's college for my undergraduate degree, and then for many formative years of my working life, I worked in the arts, which is female, mostly I can speak about gender. That's my own experience. And so I didn't really have to think about gender at all. And then I went to work in Silicon Valley at a startup, and it was an 80-20 ratio of men to women. And suddenly I was noticing gender all the time. There's lots of strategies, and one could enumerate all the strategies. But the thing I would say is that I think that one should assume that one belongs at the table all the time and just function as if one does. And not to say those strategies aren't valuable, they are, but I think underneath that, there has to be this basic entitlement, then you just don't have to think about gender. You shouldn't have to think about ways in which you might be a minority. You shouldn't have to think about that all the time as you're doing your work.
And I think we can also distinguish sort of low-hanging fruit possibilities and larger solutions that are probably more long-term as well, and that will take more collaboration to present a strategy.
We could have a whole panel just talking about strategies for that.
Of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. I had friends who at the time who work in tech, women in tech, and they were talking about they don't want to lean in to a game they don't even want to play, right? So again, I agree. We could talk about a lot of the tactics of get a mentor, negotiate your salary, all of these things. And they're all very much absolutely valuable to do, right? But I too feel that intersectionality teaches us a lot, that we actually don't know what aspect of ourselves is playing out in something that's challenging, right? So prior to working here in the US, I worked in France, so it was very normal then for people, you'd give a talk and then somebody would say, you have an accent, right? And you're like, well, referring back to the budget or the strategy or the idea, right? So there's always some component going to be playing in, right? And I too feel very much that I focus on the work. I actually find human-centered design has supported that because I can really think about being an advocate for the end user. And I typically have met those people and worked with them and done contextual inquiry. And I try to focus on that. And it's a really hard space. I actually don't know anyone, male, female, or any of the different aspects of identity that we're seeing today, who don't feel that some part of themselves is being challenged by the workplace, right? And that's across your gender, your sexual, your disability, your physical being, your nationality. It's playing out. I think what's interesting is that many companies have a social component. They say that they're committed to this, but we still talk in a lot of high tech about fit, cultural fit, and I would invite us to drop that, right? Right? There's that. What do we mean by fit? And lastly, that even when we say that we need to I too say we need to build compassion and empathy, but now I'm even questioning, like, is my empathy actually a way of seeing myself and others? Is it okay just to have others? Right. It doesn't have to be even, is my empathy a projection of me? And I'm still caught in that loop. Right? So as well as being aware of what it's like to be a woman in technology, I'm now aware of age, or I'm aware of nationality, or I'm aware of compassion's not always as innocent and as loving as it looks, right? So it also starts with being aware of your own set of biases and frameworks.
Thank you for enlarging the bias space beyond gender, because it is definitely bigger than gender. I mean, gender is a big part of it, but as somebody who is an immigrant, I experience bias in different ways. And at JPL, I experience bias in different ways. For instance, JPL is a place where people value your time there more than your skills. And it's a bothersome thing for me as somebody who is am I just need to be in this place like 10 years to finally get my voice heard? That's another bias, that we have to, fight at JPL. And yeah, there are a lot of strategies to deal with it. This is not some area that I kind of, actively thought about. I'm just experiencing it, and I'm reading from other people. But I have a friend who is now leading Rituals Lab at Stanford Design School. And he's writing about these topics in his blog, and I'm following him, and I strongly encourage you to follow him as well if you're interested in these topics. He's basically talking about, as designers, how can we kind of help develop healthy rituals at workplaces? in older societies, rituals took care of a lot of interactions, but they evolved over long periods of time, very empirically. But we don't have that kind of time. We have to, create these rituals, like interaction paradigms at workplace, fairly quickly. And I think there is room for designers to think about these as well.
I think that there are some challenges across the space, as we know. Some of the problems that companies engage in is they continue to perpetuate this thinking in this language by using words like inclusivity and diversity. Not that we have really great alternative words for that, but it's really kind of corporate speak for, hey, we'll put some money towards this diversity panel, and it'll be all white women, and we'll call it diverse. That's a problem, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't really talk about. It just kind of defaults to another demographic, and I think we need to be very, very mindful of how we're engaging and kind of allowing certain things to happen in this space.
So these may seem obvious, and we've talked about it a little bit, but what are the dangers you see in the field developing with a majority bias, and what will be sort of what have been and what will continue to be the visible and tangible results of this bias?
Well, I think what you're asking goes back to Maggie's example of the fails, right, as that being an outcome. And that outcome is an opportunity to challenge what Christine is talking about in terms of placeholders or ways of addressing but not addressing what happens when you have a majority being a majority design demographic or authoring demographic. I think that's the way I approach that question. Not sure if there are any other reactions to that.
I just have an anecdote. Because I don't have any, I can't speak to the evolution of the field. I could, but I don't think I would have anything real to say.
As we said, storytelling is a great way to translate these messages.
I was at Thanksgiving with a coworker and his friends in Silicon Valley last year. And after everyone settled down into those kind of conversations where everyone's really sharing and the group dynamic is really gelling and everyone's wanting to talk about what they really care about, everyone in the room, who were all mostly in their mid-20s to mid-30s and had done nothing but work in tech in Silicon Valley their whole working experience, they just wanted to talk about they all had like meaningful ideas about how they wanted to like impact the world in some way, and they were very sincere about it, and the only ways they knew how to articulate potential solutions was in like apps or there's an app for that, and they're just set of frames of reference for how to meaningfully engage with the world was confined to this very rarefied environment that they'd spent their whole working life in.
For everything.
Yes, and I felt empathy for them and also frustration at the limitedness. And these are the people that are thinking up new technologies for everyone, Not literally those ones in Thanksgiving, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
I love that you gave that example. And I think it's really interesting because I think we have an opportunity, instead of dealing with the reality of now challenges with predictive policing, predatory lending, there are multiple books you can find, right now that talk about many of the challenges that we have with our current approaches to this design is really getting individuals outside of the space to understand what is happening and to start co-creating for the futures that they want. And I think that's really exciting, moving beyond the app-driven thinking, the app-driven world to experience-driven. It could be VR, AR, looking at multi-sensory experiences. There's so many different ways that we can all jump together and reimagine things that we want, right?
So I'm going to add another example similar to Sara's. This was something going on in Twitter a couple of days ago. In Google, they made a conscious decision of there was a salad emoticon used in like some Google apps, and they removed the egg from it. Now it is just green, so it is vegan, so more inclusive. And I was like, oh my God, this must be a joke. I looked and looked, it was real. It really happened. And these kinds of things, I feel it is really undermining the real
Maybe a
issues.
distraction
like,
from...
Exactly. It is like too much of a distraction, too much, like what do we gain from this, really? And yeah, I don't know how to fight with it, but often we go to extremes, you know. It is like there was this extreme, now we are, oh, that's bad, but we swing to the other extreme, like all women's panels.
Right.
So it is, but I don't know, like maybe like going through these extremes, we find the, you know, balance in the middle. But we have to be conscious that, you know, fighting one thing leads us to this other, like, you know, this other way of operation and political correctness, you know, with a different agenda.
Right. Sure. So we're almost wrapped up on the hour, but I'm going to ask one that I'm super interested in, this idea of intuitive interaction and the way, like, this brought... Speaking about apps and maybe an extinction date maybe coming soon for apps, or the effectiveness of apps as solutions, what are some of the challenges or ideas maybe you have in new intuitive ways to interact with technology? And like, I'll give a brief anecdote. I think we had an installation in here last night as part of the exhibit that was called Embodied Sound Design, and it was using a hacked Connect to control, to live design the sound in the space, the DJing of the event. And it was basic, you know, people would come up, their bodies would be on an XYZ plane, and they would be moving, you know, their appendages to control different tempo, sound, etc. But it seemed like it was less intuitive because people are used to a remote or, you know, a slider or something to control these things. So as we find ways to sense our bodies and use AR and VR and things, things are less intuitive when it comes back to our body, which I think is interesting. So other ways that maybe what will come next after apps are interacting with interfaces, you guys might have ideas on.
So I like to track these like big sea change moments in technology. Mostly I like to track them for my art practice, and I've made art about some of them in the past, installations. And one of the ones that I've noticed, which of course we're all noticed, but I remember when the internet started and there was this very early on, there was this huge excitement of the collapse of geographic space, because now I can experience the other side of the world through my computer that's on my desk in my house. And that was a radical thing at the time. And then when we got mobile smartphones, you could have that experience anywhere you were in your physical life, and it could have it on your body. And I feel like apps are an extension of that capability, where you can have all of these experiences from this thing that you carry around with you everywhere in your real physical world. But I think the limitation that's there is that you're like, I'm going to just demonstrate this, you're standing and you're looking at this thing the size of your hand with your head down, which is, you know, another physical limitation that I think probably in 10 years will seem as pedantic as the one of like, wow, I'm looking at this computer on my desk in my house. So
everyone's sitting at the dinner table with their phone in their hand.
Right. So I think spatializing the experience in real space beyond this thing that we hold and look down at in our hand.
Real space, what is
real
space?
Well, I mean, like, things you can touch,
no,
the floor,
exactly,
yeah. Oh, that was a metaphorical question. Okay, cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the conversation around intuitive experiences or technology, it makes me want to try to unpack intuition and think about, well, I feel the framing of the question is more about, from the designer or the author's perspective, how quickly on board or prime for engagement is this imagined audience or this tested audience. And I think it's really interesting to think about intuition from the perspective of cognition. I think from the designer's perspective, it's about that cognitive load, because intuition is really about a more primal. I really like referring to Anne Catherine Hale's definition of the non-conscious cognition. I mean, how many people drove here today, for example? Okay. And if you drove for a long time, did you find yourself spacing out and wondering, how did I not get into a car accident? That's the non-conscious cognition. But that is a very active, rich part of the brain that informs so much of what we do. But again, it's using sort of something we pushed back again. The human brain is the model for the interaction or the system itself. So already we're in that feedback loop as designers and users in terms of what that is. But it's a great question, but I sort of push back at, well, where are we positioning this and how are we defining this?
What is intuitive?
So I too want to reframe a little bit. I think that intuition is very contextual, it's very personal, it's very human, and I think it shifts over time, and I guess that's what I mean by contextual. What's contextual to a surgeon is not the same as to a choreographer, and so, yay, good for us, right? It means that we have this huge canvas of opportunities, but some of the things that I think are exciting are the re-embodiment of interaction, that we've kind of outsourced it to screens, GUIs, WIMPs, right? And I think now we have an opportunity to reconnect the body in a way that's more evolved than just a wearable, that's actually about how we use haptic feedback, our skin, fabrics, textiles, as well as the kind of ubiquitous engagement and connectivity around us. So I think that there's going to be a lot of desire requirements for us to look at not just the user experience through the screen or through the interface, but through the choreography. I think motion and human engagement that way is going to be really important. I also think the idea of our sensual environment as a palette and as a form is going to be re-engaged, as well as various terms, mixed reality, immersion, all of those things, and how do we collaborate with others and with the physical world through that. I think there's three of the areas that I think are ripe for great design and great interaction design.
Yes, there is this notion that if I use my body, it will be more intuitive, and it is very wrong. And like Maggie says, all this interaction business is like very contextual, right? Using my voice to command might be more natural, but it's not always what I want to do. You know, at home, when I want to turn on my radio, I want to use voice. But I cannot imagine doing all my work talking to my computer. Now do this, open this, close that, move this here. It is ridiculous, you know? Yeah, it is not more intuitive. I'd rather use my touchpad to do all that work. So when a new kind of technology paradigm arrives, we all jump on it. This is going to replace everything that we know. But it is not true, you know? We still use pen and paper, you know? And there is a really good research paper on this by Abigail Salon. She's a very amazing human-computer interaction researcher, and she wrote this seminal paper on the myth of pen and paper, like how it didn't go away after we had computers for a long, long time, because it offers different, you know, it has its own features that is not replicable in another domain, right? You know, and especially in music generation, think of how humans create music. We always use instruments, you know. So in a way, MIDI is another instrument that replaced the, you know, traditional instruments, and it was more intuitive than using your arms and legs like that. So we have to be very careful about like jumping onto these new technologies and imagining that they will replace everything that there is. There are a lot of good things in our lives already.
Can I say one thing really short? Just to respond to what you said, Basak, I really like that idea, and I like to refer to that too. If anyone who was around it, hearing pop music in the 80s is like, video did not kill the radio star.
Yes.
I think this is a very interesting and exciting time to be in the design space. I think it's wonderful to have contextual experiences where we can start to play around with these tools in a very code-defined way. Very specifically, I'll give an example that I love. You know, we finished a project a year ago looking at new ways to reimagine the experience of protest, right? And a lot of that was embodied thinking. And this was co-designed by women in this group who wanted to start to scream with their bodies, not their voices, right? It was very much a response to the political situation at the time, and in a way that they really wanted to design, across these realities. And yes, we can get sucked into like, oh, this is the new tool, this is lovely, but really kind of co-designing for very specific things is a wonderful opportunity, and we just have so many more tools now. So yeah, it's exciting.
Okay, awesome. I think we'll turn it over to the audience for more questions.
So our company builds communication bots that enhance communication between people, and we're building a lot of AI into the system. And this morning before coming here, and again when I go home tonight, I'm writing the responses from the bot for various things. And we've done 2 private betas, and we've seen how people interact with the bot. And we know certain things they're going to say when they get that text message, how they're going to reply to it, and I'm writing the replies. And one of the things we saw early on is fairly quickly, people forgot that they were talking to a bot. And we saw things that we were kind of surprised us, and a lot different kinds of engagement than we even want necessarily. What are my obligations in crafting responses to remind people that they are not talking to a human being, that they are talking to a bot? How do you balance that with the engagement versus essentially, and also we're seeing people reveal things to the bot that we weren't expecting as well. And again, what do I do with that information, and what are my ethical obligations, and what are my technical obligations?
Or at least attempt to give an answer. Obviously, again, depends on context. If you're working in healthcare, you need to be HIPAA compliant. The answer would be don't. Right? Or if you're dealing in day trading, don't. Right? So there's some things that are interesting. We began by talking about anthropomorphization, right? And I was looking at some of the bots, like, my Bank of America is now going to give me Ava, right? And they've given her Ava. So it's like, now they're going to be surprised if I'm going to start responding to Ava as though she was a real human. Of course I will, because they called her Ava, and they give her a female voice, and they've given her a picture, and right. So I'd also recommend that there's actually a lot of design, visual, and communication cues you can give people. There's also a question of putting in your parsing certain alarm words that when you see, you might want to give people a reminder. If some of those technical words, if you have a semantic ring, a dictionary of words that are triggers for, hey, don't forget, I'm just a friendly service, right? Moo.com used to do a very nice little job of saying, hey, I'm just little Moo. I'm sending your message on to Big Moo, right? And it was very sweet, and it made you think, they just got a little Moo. And I understood what they were really telling me was, we received your email because it was an interactive PDF, and now we're actually going to process it. Anyway, point being, I think they're visual things. I think they're semantic keywords you can look out for. With the word, I think it's a question of how much do you want to mine the questions people ask and start looking for patterns to see if there are unmet needs in your population, and that you should be designing your bot to do that. So I don't know, others might have other ideas.
I definitely second that personification of these bots. I mean, one thing that is really interesting, there's tons of bot meetups here in LA, and it's fascinating to see companies that have done it right versus companies who just, you look at this and you're like, really? It's another woman, it's another, looking at Swelly, it's a great example, Swell, looking at the obligation that people have. As you mentioned, HIPAA compliant is huge, but also you have a lot of people playing with these new tools. Specifically, let's talk about sentiment analysis. That's a huge problem. You have these companies engaging in sentiment analysis, but they're not telling their users that that's what they're doing. I find that highly immoral. I think that's something we really, really need to consider across the board in these spaces. So there are so many touch points and things to consider, but yeah.
What I heard in your question was where should your ethical position be in your users encountering this new kind of interface that is disarming them in some way. And I think that's an individual decision. I think anytime you have a new technology that people haven't encountered before, they're going to be disarmed. If they forget about that your technology is a technology. In some respects, you've done a really good job, you know. But that you have to just decide how you want to structure that engagement with a new kind of technology experience that you're providing.
I don't really have anything to add. That was fantastic. But I think what your question reinforces is that it's really important to have a conversation around forming the best practices and aligning around those best practices in terms of what we find highly objectionable, but also in terms of sharing approaches or techniques.
It is already adding to what is being said, but we always strive to make these bots very human-like, and then we blame the user for forgetting it. It is actually not very hard to make them sound very robot-like. Like even if they use the exact same phrase with the same intonation twice in 1 minute, you will immediately understand that it's a bot. But, we don't want to do it. We want our tools to be very much human-like, and then we blame the humans when they believe it. It is, I think there is some design decisions that has to feed into how much humanness we need from this thing, which has to drive the decision-making from the beginning.
Sara, you talked about how Silicon Valley designers responded to problems with apps. And I think that happens in all disciplines, right? So architects respond with architecture, transportation designers with transportation. I think the problem is that we're not having cross-functional discussions. This panel is exemplifying that, as well as panels I went to yesterday that were solid architects, right? Solid industrial designers. That's happening at ArtCenter too. Like, how do we get that collaboration? How are you guys fostering that? How do we make that happen?
I think that's a really good point, because the other thing I thought in that experience was I wish I could get all my nonprofit leader friends in this room right now, because they're actually solving these problems, and they could use the technology expertise and just the kind of intelligence that these people have and find some ways to cross-fertilize. I don't know what the solution is, but I've also had that same observation.
I'm really glad you're asking this question, because if we think about the foundation of AI, it was very cross-disciplinary. Philosophers, linguists, cognitive scientists, et cetera, mathematicians, computer scientists. But I would say it starts with us in terms of becoming comfortable being what my former instructors used to call becoming expert amateurs, being able to go into spaces that are not your own and advocate for some of this thinking, but also begin an exchange. And I think it goes back to that storytelling is one way to start doing that.
So I do think that there's definitely space for multiple voices at the table. That was the research of Feminist AI. It was very specifically getting unheard voices, people from different knowledge systems to contribute information. So again, having computer scientists with a mother of 4 who might have no programming experience, right? I think that that's a very, very important point. I would be careful, maybe not to make blanket generalizations about, different skills that people have. Of course, it should be more multidisciplinary, absolutely, and we should be mindful of that. But I think sometimes people will use that language, and they'll say, hey, interdisciplinary, and that's sure. Of course, it's with all the academics, right? But what about the non-academics? Like, can we start to expand our thinking into co-design? Absolutely, and start to co-design with people these products are actually intended for.
I just wanted to add to that. I think there's also this fundamental thing which I've noticed, because I've switched industries 5 times in the last 4 years and kind of just been the one person who was the other practice surrounded by some other practice. I feel like people who are really engaged with what they do, they see the whole world based on what they do. Like librarians will see the whole world as conceptual artifacts to be organized, or law enforcement officers will see the whole world as a place that they can keep safe. And that is an intrinsic thing to be respected too. Where we work at JPL, the highest compliment to give anybody else is that you would make a great systems engineer. So like, how can we create interdisciplinarity whilst respecting that kind of self-affirming bias that people have as well?
I'd also like to extend an invitation to everyone that if you'd like to collaborate on a intersectional panel or a panel that includes different voices that you want to hear from, please reach out to me. I'll be around after, any of you as well. I think it's a great opportunity, and we have the space, and we're happy to host things like that, so I'd love to collaborate on those things. All right, well, thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you to the panelists. I think this was an incredible introduction to these conversations, which there is obviously plenty more to be discussed and to be investigated. So, thank you. Yay.